The air outside the small timber-framed cottage has turned sharp and thin, carrying the scent of frost and dormant earth. We are standing at the threshold of a 4th century rural settlement somewhere in the rolling hills of northern Europe. It is the onset of winter, the season that dictates the rhythm of survival for everyone living here. In this era, the sun retreats early, leaving behind long, ink-black evenings where the only barrier between the hearth and the biting cold is a wall of wattle and daub. There is no modern insulation, no central heating, and no constant hum of electricity. Instead, there is the settling of heavy wooden beams and the low rhythmic crackle of a central fire pit that serves as the beating heart of the home. This is not a place of luxury, it is a space defined by necessity. For the medieval peasant, the arrival of winter is not merely a change in the calendar. It is a physical challenge that demands constant vigilance. As the wind whistles through the eaves, the occupants of this cottage, a family of 3 generations, prepare for the long nights ahead. The hearth is situated in the centre of the main room, a circular pit marked by stones. There is no chimney in conventional sense, only an opening in the thatched roof designed to let smoke escape, though it often lingers, coating the heavy, inner timber rafters in a thick layer of soot. This soot, gathered over years, serves as a testament to the thousands of fires that have burned here. Every task performed within these walls is deliberate. To survive the winter is to master the environment, to understand the limitations of one's resources, and to acknowledge that comfort is found in the simple presence of others and the warmth of a steady flame. Life here is defined by daylight hours. When the sun dips below the horizon, the focus of existence narrows to the immediate radius of the firelight. It is a time for mending, for sharpening, and for the quiet endurance that history often overlooks. We are not just observing a house, we are observing a machine for survival where every object has a purpose, and every person has a role. The transition from the frantic pace of the autumn harvest to the stillness of winter is profound. And tonight, as the frost begins to crust the windows, the history of this survival begins in earnest. The channel's Sleepy History with Benedict is a storytelling platform created for entertainment, inspiration, education, and the promotion of positive emotional values. To understand how a family endured the crushing cold of the medieval winter, one must look at the walls that sheltered them. We are not talking about stone castles or cathedrals, but the modest vernacular architecture of the peasantry, the cruck house. These structures were born from the landscape itself, built using a technique known as wattle and daub, a method that had been perfected through centuries of trial and error. The structural skeleton of the cottage consisted of heavy curved oak timbers, known as crucks, which were often harvested from the nearest woodland. These beams were set directly into the ground or onto stone foundations, curving inward to meet at the ridge of the roof. This design allowed the weight of the structure to be distributed effectively, providing the necessary strength to support a thick, heavy thatched roof made of water reed or wheat straw. The roof was the most critical component of the house. If it leaked, the entire internal environment became unsustainable. A well-laid thatch, roughly 2 feet thick, acted as a powerful thermal insulator, trapping heat inside while allowing moisture to escape. Between these heavy wooden posts, the walls were constructed by weaving together flexible hazel or willow branches, the wattle. Like framework was in place, it was coated with daub, a mixture of local clay, subsoil, sand, and organic binders such as straw, animal hair, or even zung. This mixture, once dried, became remarkably hard and durable, forming a barrier that was surprisingly effective against the biting wind. However, it was not airtight. The nature of these materials meant that the cottage was constantly breathing. Small fissures would inevitably appear as the wood expanded and contracted with the seasons, requiring constant maintenance throughout the autumn months. Inside, the floor was rarely wood or stone. It was typically beaten earth, often covered with a layer of rushes or straw to provide a buffer against the rising damp of the ground. This floor was not merely a walking surface, it was part of the thermal mass of the home. Throughout the day, the heat from the central hearth would warm the ground. And during the night, the earth would slow release that stored warmth back in the room. It was a primitive form of underfloor heating born of pure necessity. The layout was almost always a single open room, or perhaps divided by a simple partition, where the boundaries between living space and storage were blurred. This lack of complexity was intentional. In a world where fuel was scarce, heating a large multi-room space was a luxury few could afford. By keeping the living space compact, the heat from the hearth could be concentrated, creating a small bubble of relative warmth in an otherwise unforgiving landscape. Every element of the house, from the slope of the roof to the composition of the daub, was a calculated response to the thermal reality of the Middle Ages. The centre of this life, both physically and metaphorically, is the hearth. In a 4th century peasant home, the hearth was not an appliance, but a constant companion. It was the only source of heat, the only source of light, and the essential tool for cooking. The hearth was usually a raised platform of stone or clay, directly in the centre of the main room, beneath an opening in the roof, the smoke hole. Unlike modern fireplaces that draw smoke through a chimney, the medieval hearth relied on the principle that heat rises. The smoke would drift upwards, filling the rafters, killing insects in the thatch and slowly seasoning the timbers, before eventually escaping through the aperture in the roof. Managing the fire was a skill passed down through generations. A fire that burned too bright consumed precious fuel, while a fire that burned too low risked going out entirely, requiring the labour-intensive process of relighting it from embers. Peasant families often used a curfew cover, a conical metal or ceramic lid placed over the embers at night. This would bank the fire, keeping it smouldering until the morning, so that the first light of dawn would not begin with the struggle of starting a flame from scratch. Fuel was a constant anxiety. The gathering of firewood was not a casual activity, it was a regulated and vital part of village life. Most peasants had limited rights to gather dead wood from the lord's forests, meaning they could only take branches that had fallen to the ground. Green wood was voided because it contained too much moisture and produced excessive smoke without providing significant heat. The search for dry, fallen oak or birch branches was a daily chore for children and the elderly. Every stick was weighed for its potential. In some regions, when wood was exceptionally scarce, people turned to dried peat or animal dung mixed with straw, cow chips, as a supplementary fuel. While these burned slower and cooler, they were essential for keeping the hearth alive through the depth of the night. The social structure of the home was dictated by the hearth. During the day, it was the focal point of labour, where pots of pottage simmered, a thick, slow-cooked stew of grains, vegetables, and whatever scraps of protein were available. As night fell, the family would gather round the perimeter of the hearth. They would sit on low benches or stools, keeping their backs to the cold walls and their faces toward the warmth. The firelight cast long, flickering shadows against the daub walls, turning the simple act of sitting into a ritual of endurance. This was not a place for idle leisure, but for the quiet maintenance of existence. It was here that stories were told, tools were mended, and the silence of the winter night was held at bay. The fire was, in every sense, the anchor of their reality, ensuring that despite the frozen world outside, the internal life of the household remained sustained. The protection of the human body against the medieval winter was a study in layered insulation. Unlike modern synthetic fibres that offer warmth through technological innovation, the peasant of the 4th century relied entirely on the thermal properties of wool and linen. The clothing of the period was functional, durable, and designed to move with the body during the grueling labour of rural life. The system began with undergarment, usually a long, sleeved shirt made of linen. Linen, derived from the flax plant, was preferred for its ability to be washed frequently and its smooth texture against the skin. In the biting cold, this layer acted as the base, absorbing moisture from the body and preventing the sensation of dampness that would otherwise lead to rapid heat loss. Over the linen came the woolens. Wool was the absolute backbone of medieval survival. Even when damp wool fibres maintain a degree of warmth, a property that made it indispensable for those working outdoors in the snow or rain. A peasant would typically wear a tunic or kirtle, often reaching to knees or mid, dye, cinched at the waist with a belt or rope to trap body heat. These garments were often made of homespun, heavy-duty wool that had not been finely processed, retaining its natural lanolin. This oil provided a degree of water resistance, acting as a primitive shield against the damp mist of the English or Northern European winter. Leg protection was achieved through the use of hose or chausies. These were not trousers in the modern sense, but two separate leg coverings, tied at the waist to a belt. They were made of thick woven wool cloth, cut on the bias to allow for flexibility during movement. Over the haze might wear brays, a loose, fitting pair of linen drawers and leather turn. Shoe boots. These boots were simple, often constructed from a single piece of leather sewn at the heel and toe, and stuffed with straw or wool rags during the deepest freezes for extra insulation. The head was almost always covered, as a significant portion of body heat is lost through the scalp. A hood or a close-fitting linen cap would be worn, often covered by a heavier woolen mantle or cloak when venturing outside. The strategy was constant adjustment. As the day progressed and the temperature fluctuated, layers were added or removed to prevent perspiration. Sweat was the enemy. If clothing became soaked with sweat while working, it would freeze the moment activity ceased, leading to hypothermia. Therefore was always to remain comfortably cool rather than hot. This required a keen understanding of one's own physiology and the changing intensity of the day's work. The clothing was not meant to be fashionable, it was meant to be a portable microclimate, a personal fortress. Of fibre that allowed the labourer to remain productive even when the thermometer hovered near the freezing point. In the dim light of the cottage, seeing a family mend their woolen cloaks by the fire was a common sight, a necessary pair that could be the difference between a restless night and a sound, warm sleep. All stories on this channel, Sleepy History with Benedict, are fictional, thoughtfully crafted around historic themes and inspired by real events, figures and periods reimagined for engaging storytelling. The content does not represent real individuals, actual events, or document cases. Any resemblance to real people, animals, or events is purely coincidental. As the last remnants of autumn faded in the grey, frost-bitten landscape, the final harvest became a race against the inevitable freeze. This was the most critical period in the peasant's year, where the bounty of the land had to be converted into a life support system for the winter months. Wheat, barley, and oats were not merely crops. They were the currency of survival. The threshing floor, an area of hard-packed earth, became the center of activity. Here, families used flails to beat the dried grain stalks, separating the edel kernels from the chaff. It was exhausting, rhythmic work that continued until the very last light of the day. Once harvested, the grain had to be dried perfectly. Any moisture left in the kernels would invite rot or mold, which could ruin the entire winter's supply in a matter of weeks. The grain was stored in woven baskets, wooden chests, or sacks made of coarse linen, kept in the driest part of the cottage, or in a small raised granary. Vegetables like turnips, parsnips, and onions were pulled from the cooling soil and often stored in clamps, pits dug into the earth and lined with straw and soil. This provided a stable, cool environment that prevented the vegetable from freezing solid while keeping them away from scavenging rodents. If you find yourself enjoying this journey into the quiet, rhythmic reality of the medieval world, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue to craft these immersive stories that bring the forgotten details of history to life. Clicking the like button and turning on notification ensures you won't miss our next deep dive in the lives of those who shaped the past. The processing of food extended beyond crops. Fruits were dried, and herbs such as sage, thyme, and rosemary were bundled and hung from the rafters. The smoke from the hearth played a crucial role here. By hanging produce in the upper reaches of the cottage, the smoke acted as a preservative, deterring insects and inhibiting the growth of bacteria. This vertical storage was a hallmark of medieval domestic ingenuity. Every inch of space was utilized. The rafters weren't just for structural integrity, they were the pantry of the household. Preparation also involved the slaughter of livestock that could not be supported through the winter months. Fodder was expensive and labor-intensive to store, so only the essential breeding stock was kept. The rest was processed immediately. Meat was salted, smoked, or dried to create a stable protein source. The fat, or tallow, was rendered down into blocks, a substance that served as both a cooking medium and the primary ingredient for candles. Nothing was discarded. The bones were used for broth, the hides for leather, and the offal for immediate consumption. This was a time of intense, focused labor where the community worked as a singular, unified force. The stress of the season was palpable, but it was grounded in the knowledge that every pound of food secured was an insurance policy against the long, dark nights ahead. Beyond the initial storage of grains and root vegetables, the art of medieval preservation was a sophisticated response to the scarcity of winter. With no refrigeration, the preservation of proteins, particularly meat and fish, was a specialized skill. Salt was the primary agent of this preservation, but it was also a precious commodity, often expensive and heavily taxed. A peasant family would use salt sparingly, carefully packing layers of pork or beef in wooden barrels or stoneware crocks. The salt drew the moisture out of the meat, creating an environment inhospitable to the bacteria that caused decay. Smoking was the secondary technique often used in junction with salting. The meat would be hung near the rafters, where it was subject to the rising smoke from the central hearth. This process did more than just provide flavor. It formed a chemical barrier on the surface of the meat that prevented oxidation and slowed the development of mold. The type of wood used for the fire dictated the quality of the smoke. Oak was prized for its density and the rich, deep flavor it imparted, while fruitwoods like apple or cherry were used when available to add a subtle sweetness. It was a slow, multi-week process that required consistent monitoring. Dairy preservation was more ephemeral, but equally vital. Milk was rarely consumed fresh during the winter months, as production dropped when cattle were moved to limited winter fodder. Instead, it was converted into hard cheese and butter. Cheese, in particular, was a dense, portable source of fat and protein. These wheels of cheese were stored in cool, dark corners of the pantry, often wrapped in cloth soaked in whey to prevent them from drying out too quickly. Butter was churned and heavily salted, then packed into jars. When stored properly in a cool cellar or a buried pit, this salted butter could remain edible for months. The reliance on these preserved goods created a diet that was predictable and monotonous, yet nutritionally sufficient to sustain heavy labour. Daily meals often consisted of pottage, a thick porridge, like stew that served as the foundation dish for most of the population. The ingredients were what was available: beans, onions, cabbage, and whatever salted meat could be spared. It was cooked slowly in an iron cauldron hung over the fire, with water or ale added as needed. This pottage was rarely finished. It was common practice to add new ingredients to the remaining base, creating a perpetual stew that simmered day and night. This method not only saved fuel, but ensured that the family always had access to a warm meal at a moment's notice. The texture was thick, the flavours were earthy, and the warmth it provided was the literal internal heater for the body against the sub-zero temperatures outside. In the medieval rural economy, grain was not just food. It was the bedrock of survival. The cycle of the seasons revolved entirely around the sowing, reaping, and processing of wheat, rye, and barley. Once the harvest was safely stored in the granaries or the rafters of the cottage, the task shifted to the daily grind of processing that grain into flour. This was a process that integrated the entire community, as few families possessed the equipment to mill grain on their own. The village mill, often powered by water or wind and owned by the local lord, was a hub of activity and a source of constant tension. The act of milling was a time-consuming necessity. Peasants would bring their sacks of grain to the mill, waiting in line for their turn to use the massive millstones. These stones, carved from gritstone or granite, were heavy, rugged tools that required constant maintenance, sharpening the grooves, known as dressing, to ensure an efficient cut. The mill was a place of noise, dust, and social exchange. It was here that news from neighbouring village travelled, and it was here that the multure, the fee paid to the miller, was collected. This fee was often a source of resentment, as the miller would take a portion of the flour as payment, a tax that could weigh heavily on a family during a harsh winter. Once the flour was brought home, the process of turning it into sustenance began. The staple product was dark, dense bread, often leavened with a sourdough starter kept alive from the previous week's baking. In many households, the oven was simply a flat stone placed near the embers of the hearth. Baking was done in batches, and the resulting loaves were hard and thick, designed to last for several days without going stale. This bread, often called maslin, a mixture of rye and wheat, was a dietary staple that provided the complex cowhide necessary for surviving the cold. Beyond bread, grain used for brewing ale, the safest and most reliable beverage of the era. Water sources were frequently contaminated, but the process of boiling water for ale making rendered it safe for consumption. Ale was not just a drink, it was a liquid meal, rich in calories and nutrients, that provided an extra layer of energy to those working outdoors. Every household had the capacity to brew, and the sight of a fermentation vessel tucked into a corner of the cottage was as common as the hearth itself. The grain cycle, from the field to the mill to the oven and the brewing pot, created a predictable rhythm of existence. It was a cycle of discipline, where the waste of a single handful of grain was considered a significant loss, and the management of these resources was the primary responsibility of the head of the household. In the quiet, dark months of winter, the presence of these stored grains provided a sense of security, a tangible reminder that the community had successfully navigated the year's work and were prepared for whatever the cold might bring. The structure of medieval village life was not a democracy. It was a rigid, hierarchical system based on land tenure and obligation. The status of a family within the community dictated their daily survival strategy. At the bottom of this social order were the serfs or villeins, who were bound to the land. They did not own the acreage they farmed. Instead, they held small strips of land granted by the local lord of the manor. In exchange for the right to live and farm on this land, they owed the lord labour, known as corvée, which meant working the lord's own demesne lands for a set number of days each week. This obligation did not disappear when winter arrived. Even when the fields were frozen and the ground hard, there was still work to be done. Maintenance of fences, clearing of irrigation ditches, or the processing of timber from the lord's woods kept the peasantry active throughout the coldest months. The reeve, an official chosen from among the peasants themselves, acted as the intermediary. He was responsible for organising the labour force, ensuring the lord's work was completed, and managing the disputes that arose within the village. The reeve occupied a precarious position. He had to be firm enough to satisfy the lord's demands while living among and maintaining the trust of his neighbours. This interdependence was essential for survival. No single family could hope to withstand a severe winter in isolation. They relied on a communal approach to labour and resource management. If a roof needed re-thatching, the entire community might pitch in. If a family supply of firewood ran dangerously low, the village would often redistribute a portion of the communal wood pile. This social safety net, while informal, was the difference between life and death. The manor court served as the legal arbiter for these social interactions, settling disputes over land boundaries, grazing rights, and the use of the village commons. If you find this exploration of the intricate, often overlooked social structures of the Middle Ages soothing and insightful, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. By joining our community, you support the creation of these extended, tranquil narratives that delve in the quiet corners of history. Don't forget to like this video and tap the bell icon to stay updated as we continue to unfold the story of the past, one gentle chapter at a time. The community was a closed loop. Everyone knew everyone else's business, and the shame of failure or the honour of hard work were powerful social motivators. During the long, dark evenings, when the village gathered for the infrequent communal feast or church holiday, these social bonds were reinforced. The hierarchy was understood and accepted as the natural order of things, a framework that provides stability in a world otherwise carried by uncertainty and the raw power of nature. It was a life of defined boundaries, where an individual's role was clear, and their contribution to the collective welfare of the village was the primary metric of their existence. The resilience of the medieval peasant was not just an individual trait, it was a byproduct of this deeply integrated communal social structure. The survival of the medieval household was fundamentally anchored to the durability of their tools. In a world where every task from chopping firewood to preparing the soil was done by hand, a broken tool was a crisis. This reliance on physical labour made the village blacksmith, or smith, the most essential figure in the community after the lord of the manor. The forge was located on the outskirts of the village, a small, smoke, stained build where the rhythmic sound of the hammer hitting the anvil could be heard long before one reached the door. During the winter months, the smithy became a place of intensive repair. As the ground froze, iron tools were subjected to extreme stress. Ploughshares, scythes, axes, and billhooks were brought to the forge to be sharpened, tempered, and repaired. The blacksmith worked with charcoal, which he had to source and manage carefully, as it was a precious fuel. He understood the properties of iron better than anyone, how to heat it until it reached a cherry-red glow, how to fold the metal to increase its strength, and how to quench it in water or oil to achieve the perfect hardness. These tools were not standardized, mass-produced items. Each was hand, forged, weighted, and balanced for the specific user. A peasant's axe was an extension of his own physical strength. He knew exactly how the handle felt in his grip and how the blade bit into the wood. The iron itself was often salvaged, recycled from older tools that had reached the end of their function life. The skill of the blacksmith was in his ability to breathe new life in discarded iron, turning a rusted, broken remnant into function implement for the next season. The smith provided the hardware for daily life: nails, hinges for doors, latches, and cooking pot handles were all products of the forge. In an era where wood and leather were the primary materials, the addition of iron was the defining mark of a durable object. When a peasant visited the smithy, it was a time for trade and talk. They might exchange a piece of salted meat or a bundle of firewood for the smith's labour. This exchange was the heart of the local economy, a silent understanding of mutual necessity. The blacksmith's hands, calloused and stained by coal and heat, were the hands that kept the village running. He was the architect of their physical environment, ensuring that when the spring thaw finally came, the tools of their survival were sharp, strong, and ready for the labour that lay ahead. When the temperatures plummeted, the landscape transformed. Streams, ponds, and even the slower-moving rivers would harden into thick, impassable plates of ice. For the medieval peasant, this presented a critical challenge: access to fresh water. While snow could be melted for domestic use, a laborious process requiring constant fuel, it was rarely enough to support the needs of a full household and their livestock. Therefore, the ice had to be broken. Every morning, someone from the household, often the younger members, would trek to the nearest water source with a heavy iron, tipped pole, or a thick wooden mallet. The task was to clear a hole in the ice. This was not a simple matter of breaking through the surface. The ice could be several inches or even a foot thick, requiring significant physical exertion. Once a hole was opened, the water had to be drawn quickly before the freezing air began to seal it over again. This water was the lifeblood of the cottage. It was used for everything, from watering the livestock kept indoors to the daily needs of cooking and cleaning. Because the water was often stagnant during the winter, great care was taken to draw it from the cleanest possible point in the flow. If the source was a communal pond, there was a strict etiquette regarding where one could cut the ice and how the water was accessed, ensuring that the source remained as uncontaminated as possible. Managing these resources during the dead of winter is a testament to the quiet, persistent nature of medieval life. If you have been finding this journey through the practical realities of the past both calming and enlightening, please consider supporting the channel by subscribing. Your engagement helps us reach more history enthusiasts and keeps the hearth of this channel burning brightly. A simple like or a comment on what aspect of medieval life you find most intriguing helps us refine these stories for your enjoyment. The frozen water was also a reminder of the natural world's dominance. The change in the state of the water dictated the pace of the day. One could not simply turn a tap, one had to work for every drop. This necessity fostered a deep respect for natural cycles. The rhythm of the day was dictated by the rising of the sun and the state of the ice. There was a profound, almost meditative quality to this routine. Walking out in the crisp, biting air of a winter morning, hearing the crunch of frost underfoot, and the sharp, echoing crack of the ice as it yielded to the iron tool, these were the sounds of existence. It was a life lived in direct contact with the elements, where the boundaries between the human world and the wild, frozen landscape were blurred and negotiated daily. One of the most defining characteristics of the medieval peasant cottage during winter was the presence of livestock under the same roof as the human family. This was not a choice born of lack of space, but a fundamental strategy for survival. By housing the family's most valuable assets, typically a cow, a few sheep, or perhaps a pig within the cottage, the farmers achieved two things: the security of the animals from wolves or thieves, and, more importantly, the heat generated by the animals' bodies. The animals were kept in a designated section of the cottage, often at the far end from the entrance or near the door, partitioned off by a low wooden railing or a simple wattle wool. This area was known as the byre or the cowhouse section of the longhouse. The heat produced by a large animal such as a cow is significant. In the sub-zero temperatures of a northern European winter, the combined body heat of the family and their livestock could raise the internal temperature of the small, uninsulated cottage by several degrees, preventing the hearth's warmth from dissipating too rapidly into the frozen air. This arrangement required a high level of cleanliness and maintenance. The zung had to be mucked out daily to keep the air breathable and to prevent the build-up of moisture and ammonia, which could cause respiratory issues for both humans and animals. This manure was then stored in a sheltered part of the property, where it was later used as an essential fertilizer for the fields when the spring planting season arrived. Every aspect of the animal's presence was managed to optimize the household's efficiency. The soundscape of the cottage was defined by this shared existence. The lowing of a cow, the shifting of hooves on the earthen floor, and the gentle chewing of cud were the background noises of the night. It created a bond between the peasant and their livestock that went beyond economic utility. These animals were the primary means of subsistence, providing milk, wool, and power for ploughing. To keep them healthy was to assure the family's own survival. There was a constant unspoken awareness of the animal's needs. If a cow became agitated or sick, it was immediately notable in the confined space, allowing for rapid intervention. This closeness taught generations of rural families the subtle signs of animal behavior, a wealth of practical veterinary knowledge passed down through observation. In the deep, silent hours of winter, the steady, rhythmic breathing of the animals was a comforting reminder of life in the midst of the cold. It was a symbiosis, a shared endurance that solidified the cottage as a sanctuary, where the boundaries between human and beast were softened by the shared necessity of warmth and protection. This content is inspired by and adapted from public domain works available through Project Gutenberg. The material has been transformed through original narration, editing, and storytelling to create a unique experience for educational and entertainment purposes. Maintaining hygiene within the confined, multifunctional space of a medieval cottage during winter was a task of constant vigilance. With the family and their livestock living in such close proximity, The accumulation of waste and the buildup of moisture were significant threats to health. Sanitation was not an abstract concept of cleanliness, but a practical necessity to prevent disease and maintain a habitable environment. The earthen floor, while effective for insulation, was also a challenge to keep sanitary. It was standard practice to cover the floor with a thick layer of straw or rushes. These were not just for comfort, they served as a primitive absorbent. As the straw became soiled by daily use, the damp, dirty layer would be raked up and replaced with fresh material from the stores kept in the loft. This cycle of refreshing the floor was vital. The old soiled rushes were not thrown away, they were gathered and added to the midden or compost pile located outside the cottage. This organic waste would decompose over the coming months and eventually return to the soil as a nutrient-rich fertilizer. It was a closed system where nothing was truly wasted, and every aspect of household maintenance had a secondary product purpose. The management of human waste was also handled with practical efficiency. During the winter, venturing outside to the communal latrines or pits located far from the living quarters was an arduous, cold, stricken endeavour. Families often utilized simple, portable vessels during the night, which were emptied first thing in the morning. These vessels were kept clean, often scrubbed with sand and water, and stored away from the hearth area. The focus was always on keeping the air inside the cottage as clear as possible. The smoke from the hearth played an inadvertent role here as well, the rising heat and the presence of soot-laden air had a mild disinfecting effect, helping to keep the environment from becoming overly damp or prone to rot. This life required a degree of discipline that is often lost on the modern imagination. There was no deep cleaning in the modern sense, but there was a continuous, light-touch maintenance. Every member of the household understood their role in this system. If a child spilled water, it was wiped up immediately to prevent the earthen floor from turning into mud. If a piece of thatch fell from the roof, it was pushed back into place or swept away. This constant micro-level attention to the state of the cottage ensured that even in the depth of the coldest winter, the living space remained functional. It was a lifestyle that fostered a profound awareness of one's surroundings, where the state of the room reflected the health and well-being of the entire family. It was a lesson in the necessity of order, taught not by rules, but by the relentless, freezing reality of the world outside the front door. As the sun retreated behind the horizon by mid-afternoon, the cottage plunged into deep, protracted darkness. Light was the most sought-after commodity after warmth. The primary source of illumination remained the fire pit, but as the evening progressed and the family moved away from the hearth to perform tasks, mending garments, carving wood, or preparing flax, additional light became necessary. This was achieved through the use of tallow candles and, in some cases, rushlights. Tallow candles were made from the rendered fat of cows or sheep, a byproduct of the slaughtering process described in our earlier chapters. The process of candle making was a repetitive, patient task. A cotton or linen wick would be dipped repeatedly into a vessel of melted fat, allowing each layer to cool and solidify before the next dip. It was a slow, deliberate craft that resulted in a candle that burned with a distinct smoky aroma and a soft, flickering yellow flame. These candles were precious. They consumed a resource that could otherwise be used for food or heat, so their use was strictly reserved for essential tasks. Rushlights were a more common, economical alternative. These were created by taking the pith of a common soft rush plant, peeling away most of the outer skin, and soaking the remaining porous core in leftover cooking fat. Once dried, this fat-impregnated rush would be held in a rushlight holder, a simple spring-loaded iron clip on a weighted base. A rushlight burned brighter, but for a much shorter duration than a candle, casting a erratic, dancing light that was sufficient for short-term labour. The smell was often pungent, and the burning fat would produce a steady stream of smoke, tributary to the layer of soot that coated the rafters. The reliance on these flickering lights dictated the family's evening routine. There was no reading for leisure by the glow of a lamp. Activities were functional and required high levels of dexterity and concentration, as the dim light made intricate work difficult. This limitation naturally enforced a quieter, more reflective atmosphere. The family would often work in near silence, the only sounds being the scrape of a needle against fabric or the steady rhythmic rasp of a woodworking tool. This was not a lonely darkness, it was a communal one, being together in the dimness, illuminated only by the small unsteady flames, created a sense of intimacy. The shadows stretched long and thin across the daub walls, shifting with every flicker of the rushlight. It was a time of day that required immense mental stamina, a period of long quiet endurance where the only goal was to complete the day's work and conserve the precious light, waiting for the return of the sun to bring the clarity of the morning. Even when the frost locked the earth, the necessity of trade did not cease. While the deep winter months were largely defined by introspection and domestic labour, there were moments when the needs of the household required contact with the wider world. The village, while largely self-sufficient, was part of a larger network of exchange. Salt, iron, specialised tools, and occasionally luxury items like spices or refined cloth were brought in by travelling peddlers or taken to local market towns by the village reeve or chosen representatives. These journeys were gruelling. The roads were rarely more than dirt tracks, which, during the Pyrrhic winter tours, turned into deep, treacherous quagmires of freezing mud. Travelling these paths required a knowledge of the landscape that few outsiders possessed, knowing which high ground to traverse, which streams were safe to cross, and where to find shelter if the weather turned suddenly. A team of oxen or a sturdy pack horse was the primary means of transport. These animals were slow, requiring constant care and protection from the biting wind. A trip to a market town just a few miles away could easily turn into a multi-day ordeal if the weather shifted, requiring the travellers to stay in roads shelters or with families in neighbouring villages. The nature of these changes was often based on barter: a basket of wool, a side of smoked bacon, or a bundle of firewood might be traded for iron nails, a new set of leather boots, or a bag of salt. Currency, while in circulation, was rarely seen in the hands of the peasant class. Their economy was one of value, in kind, where the worth of an item was determined by its utility and the labour invested in its production. These interactions at the market or along the roadside were the rare points of contact with life outside the village, and they were vital for the flow of information. News of local politics, changes in taxes, or rumours of harvest conditions in distant manors would travel along these routes. Back at the village, the arrival of a merchant or a returning neighbour was an event. It provided a momentary break in the monotony of the winter cycle. The items brought back were inspected with great care. The quality of the iron, the weight of the salt, the durability of the leather, everything was assessed for its long-term utility. This trade was a lifeline that kept the village connected to the greater economy of the medieval world. It was a testament to the tenacity of those who dared to travel when the rest of the world was hunkered down, seeking warmth. The endurance required to navigate these roads in the dead of winter was yet another facet of the medieval survival. Strategy, a willingness to face the elements for the sake of sustaining the household through the long, lean months. The healthcare of a 4th century peasant family was almost entirely dependent on the knowledge of medicinal plants, a tradition passed down through oral history and practical experience. As the landscape lay dormant under a blanket of frost, the dependence on stored herbs became critical. During the summer months, the cottage resident would have spent hours in the fields and hedgerows, gathering plants such as yarrow for stopping bleeding, willow bark for pain relief, and sage or thyme for their antiseptic properties. These were bundled and hung from the rafters of the cottage, slowly drying in the smoky, warm air. When illness struck during the winter, a time when respiratory infections and the dampness of the cold air made the family vulnerable, the apothecary of the home was the kitchen. A sick family member would be given teas or decoctions brewed from these dried herbs. Peppermint or spearmint might be used for stomach ailments, while infusions of dried elderberries or rose hips were valued for their high vitamin content, which was essential for maintaining strength when fresh produce was absent. The preparation of these remedies was a ritual of care. It involved boiling water over the hearth and carefully steeping the herbs to extract their properties. The understanding of these plants was not scientific in the modern sense, but it was remarkably precise in its application. It was known which plant thrived in the damp meadows and which preferred the chalky soil of the hillsides, and the timing of the harvest was crucial to ensure the maximum potency of the leaves, roots, or flowers. This knowledge was often held by the women of the household who managed the domestic sphere. They were the ones who tended to the sick, understood the subtle difference in the drying process, and maintained the supplies for emergencies. In the dim light of a winter evening, the sight of a family member brewing a hot, pungent infusion from the dried herbs hanging above was a common scene. It was a moment of focused, quiet concern. The smell of the herbs would mix with the wood smoke, creating a medicinal scent that filled the cottage. While these remedies could not cure every ailment, they provide a level of comfort and symptomatic relief that was vital for enduring the long months of isolation. This herbal knowledge was a form of resilience. It was a way of claiming agency over one's own health in an era when professional medicine was almost exclusively reserved for the wealthy or those in large monastic centres. By trusting in the wisdom of the land and the traditions of their ancestors, the peasant family ensured that they remained as strong as possible, ready to withstand the rigours of the winter and emerge in the spring with their vitality intact. Within the 4 walls of the cottage, survival was not merely a matter of endurance, but of highly specialised coordination. The labour was divided with a precision that ensured no hour was wasted. While the physical nature of agricultural work often implies a gender-neutral struggle against the elements, the reality inside the home was defined by distinct but equally demanding roles. The men, when not involved in heavy outdoor tasks like clearing ditches or logging, focused on the maintenance of infrastructure, the woodworking, the repair of heavy tools, and the care of the draft animals. Their labour was outward-facing, focused on the structural integrity of the farm. Conversely, the labour performed within the cottage was dominated by the women, whose work was a continuous, multi-faceted engagement with survival. From the management of the food stores and the rendering of fats, to the complex processes of textile production, spinning and weaving, their work was the engine of the household's material comfort. Spinning was a constant, almost rhythmic activity. In the quiet hours by the hearth, the spindle was rarely still, The ability to produce thread from wool or flax was a skill that defined the wealth of the family. A pile of finished yarn was as valuable as any coin, as it could be traded or fashioned into the clothing that protected the family from the frost. Children too had their roles. From a very young age, they were integrated into the work cycle. Whether it was gathering small kindling for the fire, tending to the smaller livestock, or assisting in the processing of grain, there was no notion of childhood as a period of leisure. By participating, they learned the essential skills required for their own future survival. This division of labour was not rigid in a way that prohibited cooperation. In times of crisis, everyone performed whatever task was necessary. However, the daily rhythm was dictated by this established hierarchy of duties. This coordination was essential for efficiency. In a space as confined as a medieval cottage, clutter and chaos were the enemies of survival. Everything had its place, and every task had its optimum time. The efficiency of the household was a reflection of the family's ability to manage their time and resources. When the light was sufficient, the more demanding physical tasks were performed. When the darkness fell, the focus shifted to the sedentary, intricate work. This rhythm was as predictable as the tide. It fostered a deep sense of discipline and purpose, where the contribution of each individual was understood as part of a larger, collective effort. The cottage was not just a home, it was a workshop, kitchen, a barn and a sanctuary, all integrated into a singular, highly efficient unit of medieval existence. In the absence of clean drinking water, the medieval diet relied heavily on ale. This was not the strong, fermented beverage associated with modern taverns, but a small ale, a low alcohol, nourishing liquid that was brewed in almost every household. The brewing process, which involved boiling water, was the very mechanism that rendered it safe for consumption. Because the water was boiled, any potential pathogens were neutralized, making ale the most reliable source of hydration throughout the harsh winter months. Brewing was a skill ingrained in the rhythm of the household. It required patience, knowledge of fermentation, and the ability to source and process grains like barley or oats. The process began by mashing the grain in hot water to release its sugars, then boiling the liquid, the wort, before allowing it to cool and ferment. Herbs, such as yarrow or ground ivy, were often used for flavouring and preservation before the widespread adoption of hops. Every cottage would have its own variation, reflecting the specific quality of their grain and the local ingredients available. Ale was more than just a drink. It was considered liquid bread. It was calorie, dense and contained essential nutrients that kept the body fueled against the biting cold. For the labourer working in the fields or the woods, a canteen of ale was an essential part of the day's supplies, providing energy that lasted far longer than water. During the long winter evenings, a warm mug of ale, sipped slowly near the hearth, provided a momentary reprieve from the pervasive chill. It was a communal experience too. When neighbours gathered, the sharing of an ale was a gesture of hospitality and a way to cement social bonds. The presence of the fermentation vessel in the cottage was a constant, quiet indicator of the household's stability. If the brew went sour, it was a source of great frustration and a sign that the storage conditions or the cleaning of the vessel had been compromised. Maintaining the starter or the yeast from one batch to the next was a closely guarded secret. This was a living tradition, a biological legacy that ensured the safety of the family's hydration. Even as the winter winds howled outside and the ground froze, the gentle, steady bubbling of the fermentation vat in the corner of the cottage was a sign of continuity. It was a reminder that life, in its most basic form, was persistent, fueled by the simple ancient science of fermentation, sustaining the family through the leanest times of the year. In the medieval village, there were no classrooms or textbooks. Education was a continuous, immersive process of apprenticeship, where knowledge was passed from parent to child through the medium of daily life. From the moment a child could grasp a tool or walk the distance to the forest, they were observing and participating in the work that kept the household alive. This was a pedagogy of necessity, where learning was measured by one's ability to contribute to the collective survival of the family. The skills a medieval peasant were vast and highly specific. A child would learn to identify which trees provided the best firewood, how to read the clouds to, predict a change in the weather, and how to handle livestock with the care needed to ensure their health. They learned the properties of different fibres, wool, flax and hemp, and how to spin them into thread. They learned the rhythm of the seasons, understanding that the cycle of planting and harvest was not just an agricultural calendar, but a moral and practical framework for living. This was not a passive form of learning, it was active and demanding. The cottage itself was the primary site of instruction. In the confined space of a single room, nothing was hidden. A young person would watch their parents mend a plough, brew ale, or process a hide, absorbing the techniques, the terminology, and the philosophy behind every action. They learned the value of resource, that a piece of iron, a sack of grain, or a bundle of rushes was not to be wasted. This was a form of stewardship that ensured the survival of the family across generations. When a task was performed, it was often accompanied by the quiet guidance or correction of an elder. This apprenticeship extended to social and moral education. The village was a place where reputation mattered, and children learned the importance of communal cooperation, the hierarchy of the manor, and the expected behaviours within the village social order. They watched how disputes were resolved, how the reeve conducted village business, and how neighbours supported one another in times of need. By the time a child reached adulthood, they were not just a labourer, they were a repository of local knowledge, capable of managing their own home and contributing to the wider community. This intergenerational transfer of skills was the bedrock of medieval society. It ensured that the wisdom of the past was preserved and adapted, allowing the village to remain a functioning, resilient unit in an often unforgiving environment. It was an education for life, by life, where every day offered a lesson in the art of existence. The hearth was the height of the medieval cottage, the only point of defiance against the overwhelmed darkness and cold of the winter months. It was rarely allowed to go out. The fire was maintained with a religious devotion, banked with ash at night to ensure that enough heat remained to spark a flame in the morning. This small glowing ember was the anchor of the household. To lose the fire was a disaster that necessitated a walk to a neighbour's cottage, a social admission of incompetence or misfortune that no head of the household wanted to face. The construction of the hearth was simple but highly functional. A ring of stones or a raised area of packed clay separated the fire from the flammable straw floor. Above, a simple hole in the thatch roof allowed the smoke to escape, a system that was never entirely efficient. The cottage interior was perpetually filled with a soft grey haze that hung in the rafters, a byproduct of the burning green wood or peat. While this smoke was a persistent irritant to the eyes, it served a vital dual purpose. It helped to preserve there. Stored meats and herbs hang above, and it acted as a deterrent to pest that might otherwise infest the dry thatch. Everything in the cottage was oriented toward the fire. The family slept on the side furthest from the door, with their feet pointed toward the warmth. During the day, the hearth was the site of all culinary labour. The heavy iron cauldron, spended by a hook and chain, was the most prized possession in the room. It was here that the daily pottage was boiled, and here that water for cleaning or brewing was heated. The area immediately around the hearth was the only place where tasks requiring manual dexterity, like needlework or carving, could be performed with any degree of comfort. If you found this immersive journey into the quiet, rhythmic reality of the medieval world enlightening, I invite you to subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to continue crafting these detailed, meditative narratives that bring the forgotten textures of history to life. Please leave a comment sharing which aspect of medieval survival has fascinated you the most, and consider hitting the like button to help other history enthusiasts discover this series. The fire was also a place of oral history. In the long, flickering hours of the night, when the wind howled outside and the only sound within was the crackle of burning oak, the hearth became the stage for storytelling. Elders would recount tales of local legends, religious parables, or the histories of their ancestors. In an illiterate society, this was the library. These stories, told in the warmth of the firelight, instilled the values, the fears, and the hopes of the community in the minds of the younger generation. The hearth was not merely a source of heat, it was the focal point of the family's identity, the source of their light, their food, and their connection to each other and to the generations that had sat before that same flame. As the calendar turned toward the end of winter, the atmosphere in the village shifted from one of stoic endurance to a quiet, cautious sense of anticipation. The spring thaw was not a single event, but a gradual, agonizingly slow process. It began with the softening of the ice on the pond and the lengthening of the shadows as the sun climbed slight higher in the sky. For the medieval peasant, this was the most dangerous time of year. The reserves of grain and salted meat were at their absolute lowest. The hungry gap had arrived. During these weeks, the discipline of the winter months was tested to its limit. With the stored supplies nearly exhausted, the family relied on the last of their dried peas, the dregs of the grain, and any foraging they could manage. They looked for the earliest signs of life, the first shoots of wild garlic in the woods, or the appearance of young nettles, which could be boiled into a thin, sustaining soup. This was a time of intense rationing, where every bite was calculated to ensure the survival of the household until the first true harvest of the new year. Yet there was a palpable energy in the air. The silence of the winter was replaced by the sound of dripping water and the first hesant songs of birds returning to the eaves. The heavy woolen cloaks were shed for lighter, though no less worn, tunics. The smithy became a place of frantic activity, as the tools for ploughing were sharpened and tested. The Lord's demesne land was prepared for the spring sowing, and the communal fields were cleared of the winter's debris. It was a time of transition, a turning of the page. The transition from the cold, protective sanctuary of the cottages to the expansive, demanding reality of the fields was symbolic of the medieval experience. The winter was a time of conservation and inward focus, a necessary period of hibernation that allowed the community to survive the harshness of the natural world. But the spring was the time of expansion and labour. It was a renewal of the covenant between the people and the land. As the frost finally retreated, the cycle began anew. The lesson learned during the darkness, the bonds forged in the shared warmth of the hearth, and the skills honed in the quiet, candlelit evenings, all of these were the foundation upon which the coming year would be built. The peasant stood in the damp, thawing earth, looked out over the fields, and prepared to begin the work once more, knowing that they had navigated the winter and in doing so had claimed another year of existence. With the earth finally yielding to the plough, the village underwent a profound transformation. The focus shifted from the containment of winter to the explosion of spring activity. The spring sowing was not merely a chore. It was a ritualized sequence of labor that required the synchronized effort of the entire community. Because few peasants owned a full team of oxen, they practiced cooperative ploughing. Several families would pool their livestock to form a single powerful team capable of pulling the heavy iron, tipped moldboard, plough through the thick, waking soil. This was a time of immense physical exertion. The men, their muscles stiff from the inactivity of the winter, were forced to find their strength again. The ploughing lines had to be perfectly straight, a feat of skill that required constant communication between the man guiding the plough and the one leading the oxen. The still heavier with the moisture of the melting frost was difficult to turn. It was a rhythmic, back-breaking dance of man, beast and tool. If the plough hit a large stone or an overlooked root, the entire team would shudder to a halt, requiring careful manoeuvring to get back on track. As the furrows were opened, the sowing began. This was often the task of the older, more experienced members of the community, who knew the throw, a practiced motion of broadcasting the seed in a consistent, even arc. It required a delicate balance. Too thick, and the plants would choke each other; too thin, and the yield would be insufficient for the coming year. The seeds, oats, barley and peas, were the most precious possession, representing the entire hope of the community for the months to come. During these long days in the fields, the social structure of the village was reaffirmed. The reeve oversaw the division of the strips, ensuring that everyone's land was ploughed according to the customary rotation. There was little room for individual ambition. The success of the village depended on the success of the collective. Amidst the mud and the labour, there was a sense of shared purpose. Even the children were involved, tasked with scaring away the hungry birds that descended upon the newly turned earth. As the sun beat down on their backs, a sharp contrast to the biting winds of only a few weeks prior, the villagers worked in a state of weary determination. The spring sowing was a declaration. Despite the darkness and the cold of winter, they had persisted, and they were ready to engage with the land once more. It was the binning of the cycle that would, through blood and sweat, bring the harvest that would eventually see them through to the next winter. Beyond the individual strips of land held by the peasant families lay the commons, the vast uncultivated stretches of woodland, heath and marsh that were vital to the village survival. These areas were not wasteland. They were a carefully managed resource bank that supported the community's domestic needs throughout the year. The stewardship of these commons was governed by an ancient set of customary rights, known as the rights of common, which dictate exactly what each household could take and when. In the early spring, the common were a hive of activity. Households exercised their right of estovers, the ability to gather dead wood for fuel and timber for minor repairs to their cottages. However, this was strictly monitored. One could only gather fallen branches. Cutting a living tree was a serious offence, punishable by the manor court. The wood was essential, not just for the hearth, but for the construction of tools and the handles of implements. Each family understood that to harvest the commons was to steal from their neighbours and threaten the future sustainability of their own resources. The commons were also the primary grazing grounds for the village livestock. When the weather warmed sufficiently, the animals were driven out to the communal pastures. This was a critical relief for the households, as it allowed the stored fodder to be saved for the next winter and gave the animals access to fresh, nutrient-rich grasses. The communal shepherd, often a child or an elder, was responsible for watching the flocks, ensuring they stayed within the permitted boundaries and protecting them from the occasional lingering predator. These shared spaces fostered a unique sense of collective identity. The commons belonged to everyone and no one simultaneously. It was a space where the rules of the manor were secondary to the rules of survival. Here the boundaries between families were porous, and the reliance on communal integrity was absolute. If a family's fence failed, their neighbour might help repair it using wood from the common. If a flock was lost, the village would join the search. It was a testament to a world where the individual was secondary to the group. The stewardship of the commons required a constant, unspoken negotiation, a balancing of needs that ensured the village could function as a single, living organism. It was the ultimate expression of the medieval social contract. Take only what you need, leave enough for your neighbour, and protect the resource that keep us all alive. While the great open fields were dedicated to the cereal crops that provided the caloric backbone of the diet, the small enclosed plot adjacent to the cottage, the garth or garden, was the true engine of daily health and flavour. As the spring progressed, this small patch of land became the focus of intense, careful labour. Unlike the communal fields, the garden was intensely personal. It was managed by the household, and its produce was used immediately to supplement the monotony of the grain-heavy diet. The medieval garden was not a place of ornament, but of absolute utility. It was here that onions, leeks, garlic and cabbages were grown, the pot herbs that formed the base of every pottage. These plants were chosen for their hardiness and their ability to provide concentrated nutrition. Alongside these were the medicinal herbs, berrage for its cooling properties, fennel for digestion, and parsley for its myriad of nutritional benefits. Every plant had a purpose, often a dual purpose as both food and medicine. The garden was a pharmacy, where one could step outside the front door to harvest a remedy for a sudden ache or a fever. Managing the garden was a sophisticated task. The soil had to be enriched with compost from the midden, which had been carefully layered with household waste and livestock manure throughout the winter. Because the space was limited, the planting was dense and multi-layered. Tall stalks of beans might be used to support climbing greens, creating a vertical canopy that maximized the harvest. The gardener had to understand the microclimate of their own plot, which corners caught the most sun, which were prone to frost, and which held the moisture best after a spring rain. The garth was also a symbol of a family's foresight. A well-kept garden, lush with greens and aromatic herbs, was a sign of a stable household. It was a space of constant small-scale maintenance. Weeding was done by hand, and watering was carried out with water saved from the cooking or cleaning. As the first fresh greens began to appear in the spring, they were celebrated as the first new life after the long grey months of winter. These vegetables were not just sustenance. They were a psychological turning point, proving that the land was once again providing. The garden was the most intimate relationship the peasant had with the earth, a place where their own labour was directly and visibly rewarded. It was a testament to the fact that, even in the depths of a rigid feudal system, the family exercised control over their immediate environment, crafting their own small green sanctuary of health and survival. In the centre of the village, or sometimes situated at the edge of the communal grazing land, the village well was the most significant piece of infrastructure. During the spring, When the groundwater levels rose and the risk of contamination from melting and surface runoff was at its peak, the well became the focus of intense collective vigilance. It was not merely a source of water, it was the primary node of the village social network. The water was drawn using a simple bucket and rope system, often mounted on a wooden frame with a windlass. Every drop of water pulled from the depths was a testament to the community's shared labour. Because the water was shared, there were unwritten, ironclad rules for its use. One did not wash clothes near the well, nor were animals allowed to drink directly from the source to prevent fouling. The area around the stone-lined shaft was kept scrupulously clean, often paved with flat stones to prevent mud from pooling and seeping back into the groundwater. The well was the village newsroom. It was the only place where almost every adult resident would appear at least once a day. While waiting for a bucket to be filled, people exchanged information that did not travel via the formal channels of the manor court. They discussed the health of the livestock, the progress of the sowing, the condition of the communal fences, and local rumours. It was here that the social cohesion of the village was woven together. If a family was struggling, perhaps due to illness or the loss of a draft animal, the news would spread at the well, and neighbours would often coordinate a quiet, informal support system. Yet this was also a place of anxiety. If the water turned murky or took on an unpleasant odour, the entire village was on high alert. The contamination of a well could mean the outbreak of dysentery or other waterborne illnesses that could devastate a population with no concept of germ theory, but a very keen understanding of cause and effect. If the well began to fail, the entire community had to mobilize to clean out the shaft. A dangerous and exhausting task involved descending in the dark, narrow hole to remove debris and silt. This was a collective burden that brought everyone together, literally and figuratively, to secure their most essential resource. The well was the physical and social heart of the village. It was the place where the independent, isolated life of the cottage met the collective reality of the medieval community, reminding every resident that they were part of a whole, tethered to one another by the very water they drank. As spring took hold and the frantic pace of sowing began to moderate, the rhythm of the household transitioned toward a new set of essential tasks, the processing of fibres. Textile production was hidden industry of the medieval world. While the fields provided the grain, the cloth provided the armour against the climate. The clothing worn by the peasant family, durable, rough-spun wool and sturdy linen, did not appear by magic. It was the result of hundreds of hours of labour, much of which was now intensified as the weather allowed for work in the open air or near the light of an open door. The processing of wool began with the shearing of the sheep, an event that required the help of neighbours to catch, hold and clip the animals. Once the fleece was gathered, it had to be cleaned of the oils, dirt and burrs collected in the pasture. This washing process was a massive undertaking, typically performed in a nearby stream. Women would spend hours standing in the cold, running water, scrubbing the wool until the fibres were clean enough for spinning. It was a physically demanding task that left hands red and raw, but it was the only way to ensure the quality of the final yarn. After washing and drying, the wool needed to be carded, a process of combing the fibres to align them so they could be spun into an even thread. This was done using two rectangular wooden paddles with fine bent wire or torn-covered surfaces. The rhythmic shuck sound of carding became the soundtrack of the late spring afternoons. Following this, the spinning wheel or the traditional drop spindle took over. Spinning was a task that could be done anywhere, while watching the livestock sitting in the cottage. or gathering wood. It was a masterclass in multitasking, where the fingers moved with an unconscious fluid grace developed over years of repetition. Simultaneously, the flax sown early in the season would begin to grow, requiring constant weeding to ensure a long, strong stem. This plant, which would eventually become the linen for shifts, aprons and bed coverings, demanded different care than the wool. The entire cycle of textile creation taught a profound lesson in patience. From the shearing or the sewing to the final woven cloth, the process took months, sometimes a year. It meant that every garment was an investment of time, a physical manifestation of a season's worth of labour. Nothing was discarded, worn. Outclothing was patched until it was unrecognisable, then cut into rags for cleaning, and finally the last scraps might be used as bedding or insulation. This culture of nothing wasted was the cornerstone of peasant life, transformed the basic bounty of the earth into protective layers that shielded the family from the relentless world outside. As the days reached their longest, the relentless labour of spring and early summer was punctuated by the arrival of midsummer, or St. John's Eve. In the medieval calendar, this was a moment of profound significance, a rare collective pause in the cycle of cultivation. The crops in the fields were well established, growing tall and green, and the intensity of the sowing had finally given way to the calmer rhythm of weeding and tending. For a few days, the oppressive demand of survival loosened its grip, allowing the village to acknowledge the turning of the sun. Midsummer was celebrated with a blend of ancient agrarian customs and the rituals of the church. The most iconic feature of the night was the bonfire. Families would gather wood and brush in the days lead up to the event, creating massive pyres on high ground overlooking the village. As twilight deepened, these fires were lit, casting a golden glow across the fields that had been worked so hard just weeks before. The fires, not just for celebration, they were believed to be protective, their smoke and light warding off malevolent spirits, ensuring the health of the ripening crops and the livestock. This was a time for communal joy, which was rare and precious. The ale was brought out in larger quantities, and whatever special food the season could offer, perhaps a bit of fresh cheese, honey, or a rare piece of meat was shared. Music, often provided by a simple pipe or a drum, and the rhythmic stomping of feet in a circle dance, filled the cool night air. It was a moment of social levelling, where the hierarchies of the manor and the village were momentarily forgotten in the heat of the celebration. People danced until their feet were sore, a stark contrast to the weary, functional movements of their daily labour. Yet even in this revelry, the practical mind of the peasant was never entirely absent. The fires were monitored, the livestock were checked, and the weather was observed with a critical eye. A good summer was essential to dry the hay and bring the harvest to a successful conclusion. The midsummer celebration were, in essence, a prayer for prosperity, a communal expression of gratitude for the abundance of the earth, and a plea for the seasons to continue their favourable course. It was a time to breathe, to feel the warmth of the sun and the presence of neighbours, and to steel oneself for the coming harvest. The bonfire, burning bright against the darkness of the short night, served as a powerful reminder of the village resilience. They had survived the winter, they had endured the spring, and now, standing in the glow of the summer, they were united by the shared hope that their hard work would soon yield the fruits necessary to sustain them through another year. Following the brief respite of midsummer, the village entered the most physically demanding phase of the entire year, the hay harvest. This was the golden time, a race against the unpredictable weather where every moment of sunlight was a resource to be harvested. Hay was the lifeblood of the medieval village. Without it, the livestock, the source of milk, wool, leather, and traction power, would starve during the winter. The entire village rhythm snapped into a state of high intensity, coordinated labour. The hay meadows were a vibrant mosaic of grasses and wildflowers left untouched by the plough to ensure maximum yield. When the timing was perfect, usually signalled by the ripening of the grass seeds, the call went out to the fields. Armed with scythes, the men would move in a steady rhythmic line, their blades cutting through the tall grass in a wide, sweeping arc. This was a task of intense skill and stamina. A dull blade or a clumsy stroke could waste precious time and physical energy. Behind them, women and children followed, turning the swathes of grass with wooden rakes to ensure the sun hit every side, accelerated the drying process. The air during the hay harvest was thick with the scent of sweet, curing grass. It was a sensory experience that defined the season, the sharp metallic ring of a whetstone against a scythe, the constant chatter of birds disturbed from their nests, and the heat radiating off the ground. The work was exhausting, often lasting from dawn till well after dusk. There was no closing time. If the sky threatened rain, the urgency escalated. A sudden summer thunderstorm could soak the drying hay, leading to rot and ruining the winter's insurance. The sight of black clouds on the horizon was the peasant's greatest fear during these weeks. When the grass had sufficiently dried into hay, it was raked into large cocks and transported by ox cart to the village, where it was stacked high in the lofts of barns, or in carefully thatched ricks. These stacks were the village strategic reserve. As the hay was secured, the mood in the village shifted from anxious exertion to a quiet, deep satisfaction. The completion of the hay harvest was the first tangible proof that the animals would survive the coming winter. It was a milestone in the annual struggle, a victory of organisation and labour over the volatility of nature. The village, covered in chaff and exhausted from days of toil, would pause to look at the towering stacks, not just piles of grass, but the stored sunlight and energy that secured their survival for another season. As July transitioned into August, the village entered a period often referred to as the hungry month. The hay harvest was complete, but the grain crops, the wheat, barley, and rye, were not yet ready for the sickle. The stores from the previous year's harvest were by this point almost entirely depleted. This was a gap in the calendar where the labour of the year had been expended, but the reward was still weeks away. It was a time of enforced austerity, where the physical demands of preparing for the main harvest were high, but the caloric intake was at its lowest. This period was a test of the village collective discipline. The diet became increasingly restricted, relying on the small amounts of pottage that could be made from the last of the dried legumes, supplemented by whatever the garden could produce. People were physically thinner, their energy levels dampened by the reduced intake of carbohydrates, yet the work could not stop. The ditches needed to be cleared for proper drainage. The fences around the cornfields had to be reinforced to keep the village livestock from wandering into the ripening grain, and the tools had to be sharpened and greased in preparation for the upcoming intensity of the harvest. In these quiet, hungry days, the community relied on the natural bounty of the late summer. The woods provided berries, blackberries, and wild raspberries, and the hedgerows offered nuts that were not yet ripe but could be used in various ways. These were not enough to sustain the village alone, but they provided a psychological boost and a necessary, if modest, injection of nutrients. It was a time of careful foraging, where every child was sent out to find what they could. This foraging was not a hobby. It was a critical strategy for survival that ensured the village could maintain its strength for the final, most crucial labour of the year. The social atmosphere was one of quiet, almost reverent anticipation. There was a shared understanding that the cycle was nearing its climax. The grain was beginning to turn, the green stalks fading into golden hue that promised the winter's bread. Everyone watched the fields with the same anxiety, reading the signs of the weather and the maturity of the ears. This was the calm before the storm, the intense physical and emotional preparation for the harvest. The village held its breath, rationing its last resources, fully aware that the next few weeks would determine the quality of their existence for the entire year to come. The hunger was a persistent, dull companion, but it was also a reminder of the purpose of their labour. The grain, soon to be harvested, was the only thing standing between them and the harsh reality of another winter. As the grain reached full maturity, the village transformed into theatre of urgent, synchronized action. This was the most critical juncture of the medieval year. The harvest was not merely a job, but a high-stakes campaign against time and the elements. The entire community, from the youngest children to the eldest, abandoned all non-essential activities. Every pair of hands was a vital asset. Men, women, and children moved into the fields at the first light of dawn, the air heavy with the scent of dry earth and ripening straw. The process was defined by a strict practice division of labour. The men, using long-handled sickles or scythes, moved in a coordinated phalanx, cutting the grain with precise sweeping strokes. Their goal was to minimize loss, ensure the cut was low to the ground to maximize the straw yield. Behind them, women and older children followed, gathering the fallen stalks into sheaves. They bound these with twist straw ropes, a skill that required both speed and strength to ensure the knots would hold during transport. These sheaves were then stood upright in stooks, small, temporary shocks designed to allow air to circulate and keep the grain dry until it could be moved to the barn. The pressure was palpable. A single heavy rainstorm at this moment could cause the grain to sprout or rot in the fields, effectively wiping out the year's labour and leading to the catastrophe of famine. Content lasting 12 to 14 hours a day, the physical toll was immense. Blisters, aching backs, and skin irritated by the sharp, bristly awns of the grain. Yet there was a profound shared momentum. The village functioned as a single organism, each person's movement synchronized to ensure that the precious cargo was safely gathered. This was the time when the medieval social contract was most visible. The lord's demesne land was harvested first, a requirement of feudal obligation, but the work was carried out with a focus on speed that served the entire community's need for security. As the golden expanse of the fields slowly gave to barren, stubbled earth, a sense of relief began to displace the tension. The stacks grew in the village yards, fortresses of potential bread and ale. By the time the final sheaf was bound, the atmosphere was one of profound exhaustion mingled with triumph. They had successfully navigated the dangerous transition from growth to storage. The harvest was not just the collection of crops, it was the ultimate collective act of defiance against the threat of hunger, securing the survival of every household for the long, cold cycle to follow. Once the harvest was secured in the barns, the transition from stalk to seed began in earnest. This was the work of the threshing floor, a hard, clean space, often of packed hay or stone within the barn, where the grain was separated from the straw and chaff. Threshing was a rhythmic bone, jarring labour performed throughout the autumn, The workers used the flail, a simple yet lethal tool consisting of 2 wooden sticks joined by a leather swivel. Standing in pairs or teams, they would bring the flails down in a repetitive, percussive cadence, beating the sheaves until the grain loosened from the husks. This was work of extreme endurance. The sound of the flails, a constant, rhythmic thwack echoing from every barn in the village, became the definitive noise of the season. The air inside the barns was choked with dust and broken bits of straw, making breathing difficult and requiring the workers to tie rags over their noses and mouths. It was a monotonous, back-breaking process, yet it required total concentration. One misstep could result in a painful strike from a neighbour's flail. The rhythm served as a social metronome, allowing workers to sustain their energy through hours of tireless, heavy impact. Once the bulk of the material was threshed, the process moved to winnowing. This was the elegant final stage of purification. On a day when the wind was steady, the mixture of grain and chaff was carried out in the open air. Using wide, shallow baskets or wooden shovels, the villagers tossed the mixture high into the air. The heavy, valuable grain kernels fell straight down on the waiting cloths, while the lighter chaff and dust were carried away by the breeze. It was a process that required a delicate hand and an intimate knowledge of the wind's behaviour. The winnowing was a moment of profound psychological weight. As the golden heap of clean grain grew, the family could finally calculate their wealth. This was the yield, the tangible evidence of the year's toil. Each household would carefully measure their grain, setting aside a portion for the next year's seed, a portion for the miller to be ground into flour, and a portion to pay the tithes owed to the church and the manor. The remainder was their security. Seeing the grain clean and ready for storage brought a sense of profound stability. It was the physical manifestation of their survival, a resource that would be carefully guarded, locked away in chests or deep bins, and consumed with extreme frugality. This grain was the promise that, no matter how severe the coming winter, the family had done their part to ensure they would see another spring. As autumn deepened and the air turned sharp, the village focus shifted from the open fields to the dense, ancient woodlands that bordered the manor. This was the masting season, the time when oak and beech trees dropped their acorns and mast, a rich, oily food source that was critical for the survival of the village livestock. The swine were the primary beneficiary of this woodland bounty, and for several weeks the forest became a vital extension of the farmstead. The process of pannage, the legal right to feed pigs on the commons, was a carefully regulated practice. Pigs were driven in the deep woods by the swineherd, who lived with the animals among the trees. This was a lonely, arduous life, requiring the swineherd to be both a guardian against predators, like wolves, and a skilled navigator of the rugged, overgrown terrain. The pigs were essential to the medieval economy. They were hardy, capable of foraging for themselves, and turned otherwise useless forest forage into high-quality fat and protein. For the villagers, the fattening of the pigs was a matter of extreme strategic importance. A pig that spent the autumn gorging on acorns and beechnuts would reach a critical weight before the first hard frosts. This fat was not merely a luxury, it was the essential fuel for human bodies during the darkest months of the year. The animals would be slaughtered as the temperatures plummeted, with every part of the carcass processed, salted, or smoked to ensure nothing was lost. This was a form of living storage, where the forest acted as a pantry and the pigs act as the vessels for that stored energy. The relationship between the village and the forest during this time was one of deep respect and dependency. The forest was not merely a collection of timber. It was a managed ecosystem. If the trees failed to produce a good crop of mast year failure, the entire village would suffer, as they would have to dip into their precious grain reserves to feed the animals or face a winter with less lard and cured meat. The swineherd's return with the fattened, healthy herd was always an occasion of quiet celebration. It signalled that the community had successfully leveraged the surrounding wilderness, turning the seasonal cycles of the trees into physical substance that would keep the hearth fires and the family life going through the encroaching winter. With the arrival of the first hard frosts, the village reached the moment of the great slaughter. This was a grim but necessary culmination of the autumn preparations. Keeping livestock through the winter required fodder that the village simply could not spare. Therefore, any animal not needed for breeding or as a draft beast had to be culled. This was a day of intense labour and sensory overload, where the entire village joined forces to transform living, breathing creatures in the cured stores that would sustain them for the next 6 months. Nothing was wasted. The slaughter was a masterpiece of total utilization, reflecting the absolute frugality of the era. The blood was collected to make thick, nutrient, dense puddings. The hides were carefully scraped and prepared for tanning into leather, for footwear and straps. The bristles were saved for brushes, and the bones were boiled down for stock or turned into simple tools. The meat, the pork, and in some cases beef, was immediately subject to the process of preservation. Salt, a precious and often expensive commodity, was rubbed in the cuts, while others were hung in the rafters of the cottage to be cured by the smoke of the hearth. The focus on fat was paramount. In a world of chronic caloric deficit, animal fat was the most valuable component of the harvest. It was rendered down into lard, a clean, white, stable substance that could be kept for months without spoiling. Lard was the essential frying medium for the pottage, an energy booster for the cold mornings, and a vital salve for cracked, chapped skin. Jars of rendered lard, carefully sealed, were the true measure of a family's winter security. The more fat a household could store, the safer they were against the debilitating effects of malnutrition and the extreme cold. This process was deeply sombre. While it provided the necessary sustenance for survival, it was also a stark reminder of the fragile boundary between the living and the dead. The rhythm of the work was relentless, conducted in the biting air of late autumn, with fingers numb from the cold and the smell of blood and wood smoke clinging to clothes and skin. Yet there was also a quiet confidence in the outcome. As the rafters filled with salted hams and the crocks were packed with lard, the sense of vulnerability began to recede. The village had successfully banked the summer's energy. The slaughter was the final act of autumn. It cleared the barns, filled the pantries, and signalled to the community that they had done everything within their power to withstand the coming darkness. They were now, as far as the limits of their world allowed, prepared. As the final golden leaves of autumn were stripped from the trees by the increasingly bitter northern winds, the focus of the medieval household pulled sharply inward. The cottage, which had functioned as little more than a dark, brief resting place during the frantic dawn to dusk labour of the summer and harvest seasons, now had to be transformed into a defensive fortress against the impending freeze. The structural integrity of the home was the family's primary shield against hypothermia, and preparing it was a race against the arrival of the first true blizzard. The primary vulnerability lay in the walls. Most peasant dwellings were constructed using the wattle and daub method, a framework of interwoven hazel or willow sticks coated in a thick plaster of mud, straw, and livestock dung. Over the course of the hot summer and rainy autumn, this mixture would inevitably dry out, crack, and pull away from the wooden posts. A single unnoticed fissure could allow a freezing draught to cut through the interior, rendering the hearth fire useless. Families spent days mixing fresh, freezing mud and patting it in the gaps with their bare hands, smoothing out the exterior to create a windproof seal. The cold made the mud stiff and painful to work with, but the necessity of the task brooked no delay. Above their heads, the thatched roof required equal vigilance. If water penetrated the thatch during a winter storm, it would not only rot the structural timbers, but also ruin the family's stored grain and dried herbs hidden in the rafters. Men climbed simple wooden ladders to patch thin spots with fresh bundles of rye straw or river reeds, securing them with hazel spars. Inside the cottage, insulation was improved by packing dried bracken, moss, and ferns into the crevices between the roof and the walls. The earth floor was covered with a thick, clean layer of fresh straw, which acted as a primitive carpet to insulate the family's feet from the frozen ground beneath. Simultaneously, the accumulation of fuel became an obsession. While the rights of common granted peasants access to dead wood, the sheer volume required to keep a hearth burning continuously for 4 or 5 months was staggering. Every member of the family was mobilized to haul wood, gorse, and peat from the surrounding wilderness. This fuel was not just tossed into heap, it was meticulously stacked along the exterior walls of the cottage under the overhanging eaves. This served a brilliant dual purpose. It kept the firewood dry and protected from the snow, while the massive stacks themselves acted as a dense, insulating barrier that further shielded the living space from the howling winter gales. When the final log was stacked and the wooden shutters were barred, the cottage grew dark, cramped, and smoky. But it was safe, a self-contained cocoon capable of preserving human life through the dead of winter. As December reached its nadir, the village was swallowed by the deep winter. The sun, when it appeared at all, was a pale, low, hanging orb that offered no warmth, barely skimming the horizon before retreating into the long, suffocating dark. This was the time of the solstice, the astronomical turning point that, for the medieval peasant, held both a deep primal anxiety and a glimmer of profound symbolic hope. The world outside effectively ceased to be a place of human activity. The fields were locked in iron, hard frost, and the pathways between cottages were often blocked by heavy drifts of snow. Inside, the atmosphere was defined by the long night. The hearth fire became the absolute centre of existence. Was never allowed to go out. Banking the embers under layer of ash at night was a ritual of survival, as rekindling a fire from cold tinder was a difficult and wasteful task. The smoke, trapped by the lack of windows and the narrow central smoke hole in the roof, created a thick sting haze that hovered in the rafters. It darkened the walls and permeated every fibre of clothing, serving as a constant, biting companion. The family life condensed into the small circle of light cast by the flickering flames, a tight, intimate sphere of human connection amidst the overwhelmed silence of the frozen landscape. This period was characterized by the winter silence. Outside, the natural world was dormant. Birds had migrated, insects were absent, and even the livestock were huddled and quiet in their pens. This forced stillness demanded a psychological transition. The intense physical labour that had defined the peasant's existence from spring through autumn was replaced by an almost meditative monotony. This was the time for mending clothes, mending tools, mending the very social fabric of the household. It was a season for storytelling, for the aura transmission of local history, and for the retelling of the myths that explained their world. The darkness outside necessitated the cultivation of an inner light. The solstice itself was marked with a mixture of Christian ritual and ancient, inherited custom. Despite the harshness of the conditions, there was a collective, unspoken acknowledgement that they had reached the bottom of the cycle. From this day forward, the days would lengthen, however imperceptibly. This was the turning of the year, a subtle but vital psychological shift. The gloom of the solstice was tempered by the promise that the light would return. It was a time of faith, not just the religious faith of the church, but the stubborn, essential faith in the persistence of the seasons. Surrounded by the cold and the dark, the villagers held to the knowledge that the sun would eventually thaw the earth, that the seeds were sleeping beneath the frost, and that their endurance, once again, had carried them through the hardest part of the struggle. In the profound stillness of mid-winter, the hearth became the altar upon which the survival of the village was constantly renewed. Because the weather rendered field work impossible, and the extreme cold made outdoor activity dangerous, the cottage interior became a micro-society of forced intimacy. The hearth fire was not merely for warmth, it was the engine of the household economy. It was where the pottage pot hung permanently, its contents simmered and thickened with the last of the grain, the dried herbs gathered in summer, and the preserved meat from the autumn slaughter. This was the season of the great mending. With no new production possible, the integrity of the family's possessions became the primary focus. Every garment was inspected and every tool was evaluated. Men would sit near the fire, carving new wooden handles for shovels or axes, using the slow, deliberate pace of the season to ensure their tools would be ready for the spring thaw. Women spent endless hours by the firelight, spinning the remaining wool and weaving or patching the family's heavy, coarse clothing. This was not a passive activity. It was a rhythmic, focused labour that kept the hands busy and the mind sharp. The constant clatter of the loom or the hum of the spindle provided a steady cadence that warded off the encroaching listlessness of the dark months. The firelight also facilitated the essential transmission of culture. In the absence of literacy and written records, the long winter nights were the classroom of the village. Elders would recount the history of the manor, the specifics of local land rights, and the cautionary tales that warned against greed, laziness, or pride. These stories were more than entertainment. They were the repository of the village collective intelligence. Children learned the boundaries of their world, both physical and moral, through these narratives. They were taught the importance of cooperation, the history of their ancestors' struggles, and the specific time-honoured rituals that kept the village bound together as a coherent unit. Yet this period of confinement also carried the threat of despair. The winter blues were a real and dangerous force. The crushing repetition of the dark, the monotony of the diet, and the lack of sunlight could drain the spirit. To counter this, the village relied on the strength of its social bonds. Neighbours would visit one another, braving the frozen paths to share a bit of fuel, trade a handful of grain, or simply to sit in another's hearth glow. These visits were vital. They prevented the isolation of individual households and reaffirmed the collective nature of their existence. The hearth was the heart of this resistance, a glowing, warm centre in a world of ice, proving that as long as they could keep the fire burning and remain in conversation with one another, the darkness could not truly conquer them. As January bled into February, the village entered what was often the most dangerous phase of the medieval year, the late winter starvation. By now, the grain stores were dangerously low, the reserves of cured meat were depleting, and the psychological weight of the confined life had reached its peak. This was not a time of famine in the sense of total collapse, but rather a time of severe managed scarcity. The body, deprived of fresh nutrient for months, became susceptible to every ailment, and the threat of illness grew with every passing week of communal confinement. The diet during this period was a study in grim frugality. The pottage became thinner and more watery, often consisting of little more than boiled pulses, dried peas or beans, and the last of the cabbage stored in the cool, dark corners of the cottage. Bread was a luxury, as the grain had to be strictly rationed to ensure enough was saved for the upcoming spring sowing. To eat the seed grain was the cardinal sin of the peasant. It was an act of cannibalism against the future. If a household failed this test of discipline, they faced the near certainty of ruin when the planting season arrived. Consequently, there was a quiet, desperate tension that permeated every household. Physical health began to suffer noticeably. With access to fresh produce, the lack of vitamin C led to the sluggishness and bleeding gums of scurvy, a common winter companion. Colds, coughs, and fevers swept through the village, often exacerbated by the thick, stagnant smoke of the hearths and the lack of ventilation. Because people lived in such close quarters with their livestock, which were often brought inside or housed in the barn, attached to the cottage disease, passed easily between humans and animals. A cough in one cottage could become an epidemic in the village within a week, and there was little to do but wait for it to pass. This was the season of the waiting. Every resident, from the youngest child to the oldest elder, kept a constant, vigilant watch on the horizon for the first signs of the thaw. They checked the depth of the snow, the condition of the ice on the village pond, and the behaviour of the few hardy animals that remained active. It was a time of extreme vulnerability, where the strength of the community was tested by the sheer persistence of the cold. The social fabric was stretched thin by hunger and fatigue, yet it was also reinforced by necessity. No one could survive the late winter alone. The sharing of a bit of extra fuel, the lending of a hand to help a neighbour who had fallen ill, or simply the act of checking on one another's well-being became the primary currency of survival. They were a small, fragile group of humans, huddled against the vast, indifferent power of the winter, holding on by a thread, waiting for the earth to wake up once more. The transition from late winter to early spring was never a single event, but a series of fragile, tentative clues. It began in late February or early March, often heralded by the shift in the wind from the biting north to a slightly softer, moisture-laden western breeze. For the villagers, this change was felt physically before it was seen. The air lost its sharp, metallic bite, and the deep, persistent silence of the frozen fields was broken by the sound of dripping water. This was the most hopeful sound in the medieval world, the sound of the earth beginning to breathe again. The first visual proof of the thaw was the emergence of the patchwork earth. Where the snow melted in protected spots south-facing walls, or along the edges of the woods, the dark, damp soil reappeared. This sight sparked a sudden, electric change in the village mood. The lethargy of the past few months evaporated, replaced by a surge of renewed purpose. Families stepped out of their cottages, their eyes adjusting to the brighter light, to survey the damage of the winter. They cleared away the collapsed thatch, shovelled the lingering drifts away from barn doors, and checked the condition of the tools that had been mended during the long dark nights. The livestock, too, felt the change. The animals, which had spent weeks huddled in the barn, grew restless as the temperature climbed. Turn them out in the muddy, partially thawed yard for the first time was a major event. Their return to the open air, however bleak the landscape, was a sign of the cycle restarting. The chickens began to peck at the softened ground, and the cattle, though thin and ragged from their winter confinement, moved with a hint of their former vigour. For the villagers, watching the animals move across the thawed earth was a mirror of their own survival. They had made it through. However, this was also a time of extreme caution. The false spring was a constant danger. A few warm, sunny days by a sudden punishing frost could kill the early, sprouting crops and weaken the livestock further. The transition required a delicate balance between hope and realism. They began to prepare the compost, mixing the winter's accumulation of manure and household waste to be spread on the garden plots. The focus shifted from survival to preparation. Every action was now calibrated toward the coming planting season. The village was shaking off the shroud of winter, readying itself for the inevitable, grinding labour of another year. The thaw was not a holiday. It was the starting gun for the most critical race of their lives, the race to plant the seeds that would become next winter's bread. With the arrival of real warmth, the village rhythm surged from preparation into full-scale production. The ground, finally free of its icy crust, had to be readied for the most important work of the cycle, the spring sowing. This was a task that required perfect timing. The soil had to be dry enough to turn with the plough, yet moist enough to nourish the seeds. If the farmers moved too soon, the plough would only create heavy, unworkable clods of mud. If they waited too long, they would miss the crucial window of growth before the summer heat peaked. The ploughing was the most dramatic demonstration of the village's collective power. A single peasant rarely owned a full team of 8 oxen, so the village practiced a sophisticated form of cooperative labour. Households pooled their teams, creating the massive lumbering lines of oxen necessary to pull the heavy iron, tipped ploughs through the dense, sodden fields. This cooperative effort was the foundation of the manor economy. It was a slow, deliberate, and physically exhausting dance of man and beast, moving in long, straight lines across the landscape. The earth was turned in great, rich-smelling furrows, exposing the dark, fertile subsoil to the air, a sight that offered a profound promise of abundance. Following the plough, the sowing began. This was a task of tradition and precision, carried out by hand. The sower would walk the furrows with a bag of grain slung over his shoulder, casting the seed in a rhythmic, sweeping motion. Every flick of the wrist was calculated to achieve an even distribution. Too thin, and the weeds would overwhelm the crop. Too thick, and the plants would compete for nutrients, leading to stunted growth. It was a learned craft, passed down through generations, requiring a deep intuitive knowledge of the specific requirements of each field and each grain type. As the grain hit the soil, it felt like the final step in a long, arduous process of belief. The village had invested their last reserves of energy and their precious remaining seed into the earth. The landscape, which had been grey and skeletal only weeks before, was now a tapestry of potential, with the freshly turned fields offering a striking contrast to the budding green of the hedgerows. The atmosphere in the village was one of intense, controlled optimism. Everyone knew the risks, the late frosts, the potential for drought, or the threat of pests, but for now the cycle had successfully turned. They had returned to the earth, and in doing so, they had reasserted their place in the world. The sowing was finished, the waiting, in an entirely different sense, had begun. While the great fields were dedicated to the cereal crops that provided the calories for survival, the small plot of land adjacent to the cottage, the garth or kitchen garden, was the primary source of health and dietary variety. As the fields were sown, the focus shifted to these intensive patches, which were managed primarily by the women of the household. This was a form of high-stakes micro-agriculture where every square inch of space was utilized to provide the vegetables and herbs that would define the flavor and nutritional profile of the family's meals for the coming year. The garden was a complex, multi-layered system. Peas and beans were the staples, planted in dense rows to provide the plant-based protein necessary to supplement the grain-heavy diet. These were hardy, reliable crops that could be dried for long-term storage, acting as a crucial insurance policy against the leaner months. Alongside them, the garden grew a variety of root vegetables, parsnips, turnips, and carrots, which offered not just sustenance but essential minerals. Herbs such as sage, parsley, mint, and fennel were not merely for seasoning, they were the village's pharmacy. Used to treat ailments, preserve food, and add life to the monotonous boiled pottage that remained the standard daily fare. The work of the garden was distinct from the heavy labour of the fields. It was precise, constant, and demanded a different kind of vigilance. Weed management was a daily obsession, as aggressive wild plants would quickly choke out the garden crops if left unchecked. The soil here was kept rich and dark with kitchen scraps, wood ash from the hearth, and small amounts of manure, creating a cycle of fertilization that made these tiny plots the most productive land in the entire village. It was a space where the family could exercise more direct control over their fate than they could in the vast communal grain fields. This garden was also the site of a subtle but vital connection between the domestic space and the natural world. In the quiet hours of the spring morning, the garth was alive with the activity of bees, which were essential for pollinating the garden and providing the household's only source of concentrated sweetness, honey. The garden was a labour of love and necessity, a place where the family's efforts yielded immediate, visible results. As the first green shoots of the peas and the delicate leaves of the herbs began to emerge from the black earth, they offered the family a psychological boost. It was a tangible sign that the cycle was flourishing. The garden was their primary line of defense against malnutrition, a testament to the skill and constant attention of the women who ensured that, even when the grain was low, the pot would still contain something nourishing. As the spring turned in the lush, rapid growth of early summer, the village entered a period of deceptive calm known as the time of weeding. With the grain crop established and pushing upward toward the sun, the primary task was to ensure these seedlings were not suffocated by the aggressive encroachment of weeds, thistles, docks, and charlock, which thrived in the same fertile soil. This was work that demanded immense patience and attention to detail. Men, women, and children would move through the rows, often on their hands and knees, pulling the invasive plants by the roots to ensure they did not return. The fields, once bare and brown, were now a carpet of vibrant green, representing the village capital investment. Because medieval crop yields were modest compared to modern standards, every plant that was choked out by a weed represent a direct loss of bread for the winter. This was a time of collective vigilance. The village guards, often the elders or those too frail for the heavy ploughing, would patrol the edges of the fields to keep wandering livestock from straying in the corn and trampling the developing stalks. The boundary between the cultivated crop and the wild, untamed meadow was a line that had to be defended every single day. This phase was also the moment when the village reliance on the natural environment was at its most sensitive. The summer sun, while essential for growth, brought the constant threat of drought. The villagers would watch the sky with a mixture of reverence and anxiety, reading the formations of clouds and the direction of the wind as signs of potential weather patterns. If the summer was too wet, fungal diseases like rust could sweep through the wheat, turning the grain black and inedible. If it was too dry, the stalks would wither before the ears could fill. They had done their work. The planting and the weeding were behind them. But their success was now largely out of their hands, resting with the temperamental mercy of the elements. Despite the uncertainty, there was a unique beauty to this season. The fields, rippling in the breeze, felt alive with promise. For the first time in the year, the relentless, bone-crushing labour of the early spring had softened into steady, rhythmic maintenance. There were moments of quiet, particularly during the humid, warm evenings, when the village could catch its breath. People would sit outside their cottages as the light faded, listening to the chorus of crickets and watching the crops darken in the twilight. They were suspended in a state of hopeful anticipation, knowing that the harvest, the true test of their year, was approaching, but for now they were allowed to watch their survival grow. It was a time of quiet confidence, a brief green intermission between the hard work of the past and the desperate urgency of the future. Sleepy History with Benedict is created for relaxation, entertainment, and sleep purposes. The stories shared on this channel are inspired by historical events, daily life, and real periods in history, but they may be simplified, adapted, or narrated in a calming way to enhance the listening experience. This content is not intended to be a precise academic or educational source. While we aim to stay generally accurate, some details may be altered for storytelling flow and relaxation. Please do not rely on this channel as a primary source for historical research or study. By listening, you acknowledge that this content is designed to help you unwind, relax, and fall asleep. Thank you for your understanding and support.